at the end of the presentation for questions as well. But if things come up, you know, I would love for this to be as interactive as possible. So just drop those in the chat and Emily or Denise will let me know. Give me one sec while I share my screen with everybody. All right. This is always all these logistics things are always fun. I'm going to minimize us. Give me one sec, everybody. There we go, present. All right. So what's going on with SCOTUS? There was some news this week, and I wanted to just give everybody a sort of rundown of what we're hearing about the U.S. Supreme Court. So the case that the U.S. Supreme Court has decided to take is called Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. And this case is one that is particularly concerning for those of us who are advocates for reproductive rights, because what this case really does is it presents a direct challenge to the key findings in Roe v. Wade and in Planned Parenthood v. Casey. So this is a case that the U.S. Supreme Court has had the option to take for at least a year or so at this point. When the Supreme Court decides what cases they want to take, they take conference. And so they have a conversation about, you know, which cases are we going to take? And they have conferenced and considered taking this case at least a dozen times. So it was really interesting to see on Monday that they had actually decided to hear this case. And so it's concerning for a few reasons. The case is about a Mississippi law that was passed in 2018 that bans abortion at 15 weeks, which is far before the point of fetal viability and is a very early in pregnancy abortion ban. This law was blocked from enforcement by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Fifth Circuit is considered to be relatively conservative. It's the circuit that has Texas, Louisiana, I believe Alabama and Mississippi. And those are 4 states that are really anti-choice and that have had a lot of laws that have gone through the Fifth Circuit. And it's typically a circuit where we don't see a ton of great decisions for reproductive rights. But this law was deemed by the Fifth Circuit to be clearly unconstitutional. And so it is concerning to us that the US Supreme Court has decided to take it, because generally, like, they could have just dismissed this and said that the lower court ruling would stand, especially because there was no what we call a circuit split. There was no other circuit court that had weighed in with a different opinion, because that's a situation where normally SCOTUS would take a look at a case, but there's no real reason for them to review this. And the second thing that's particularly concerning, of course, is that the question that the Supreme Court has been asked to answer is basically, is any ban on abortion before fetal viability unconstitutional? And up until this point, under Roe and Casey, the answer has always been a resounding yes. You cannot ban abortion before fetal viability. And this case definitely presents an opportunity that could result in the overturn of Roe. And a more immediate impact would potentially be a lot of abortion bans in other states that are currently blocked by the courts potentially going into effect. So in 2019 and really into 2020 and 2021, we saw more state legislatures taking action to ban abortion very early in pregnancy. We saw a lot of 6-week bans, and that trend has really continued over the past few years. So I think there's a lot of concern about if the Supreme Court were to issue a decision that really either overturns Roe or erodes the protections for Roe, we could see a lot of states that would almost instantly lose access. And I don't want to be alarmist, but this is definitely something that we are all watching and thinking about, and that has really been, in some ways, is a natural conclusion of the anti-choice movement's playbook and the way we've seen them operate in the past few years. Their goal has always been to bring a case that would present a challenge to Roe and really to try and overturn it. That has always been their goal. So this is a case we're watching really closely. I think there's like a variety of outcomes that are possible here, but generally, given the makeup of the Supreme Court, you know, we have really a 6-3 conservative majority. We're not feeling optimistic. We are concerned about this case. And it's probably, I mean, it's definitely something that y'all are going to be hearing more about, that we're talking about with our supporters and with our networks. And we're thinking it's most likely that there could be a decision in June of 2022 based on their typical calendar. But it's the Supreme Court and they can do whatever they want. So but that's what we're expecting. So why does this matter? I mean, I probably don't have to tell you folks why it matters, right? A country without Roe v. Wade would result in a patchwork of states that have access, and large swaths of the country in the Midwest and the South in particular that might not have access. But I think there's an interesting tie-in to how this impacts the issues that we're dealing with in Kansas in particular. So I'm going to pause. Are there any questions in the chat or anything I need to answer?
Not so far.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thank you both. So the 2021 legislative session. 2021 was a really bad year for reproductive rights. I feel like in some ways, a lot of the malfeasance and the bad policies that have been going on at the state level have kind of slid under the radar a little bit this year. Obviously, we're all dealing with various crises, right? We're still in the middle of a global pandemic. We are still dealing with all of the fallout of that, not just from a public health perspective, but in terms of, unemployment, in terms of, questions about making sure we can have schools that are reopened in a way that is safe. Like there's a lot of other policy issues that are at the forefront right now, as they should be. These are things that impact people's lives in a big way. But sort of behind the scenes, this has been one of the worst years I think we've seen in at least a decade when it comes to anti-choice legislation. So just this year, and this was as of just a few days ago, because every state legislature is on a different calendar, but most of them meet in the spring. And this is as of, I think, May 16th. These were the numbers. So there have been 549 abortion restrictions that have been introduced in 47 states. That's a lot of bad bills. 70 of those have passed in 15 states, which is a lot. Every year there is always, there are always bad actors. There are always legislatures that are really going hard to push anti-abortion bills. But 70 is a lot across the country. This is probably one of the worst years we've seen since the early 2010s, when there was a big wave of anti-abortion policies. But this is kind of going to go down as a not good year. And when we look back, there have been 10 abortion bans that have been passed. Some of the more extreme ones are some bans on abortion at 6 weeks in Idaho, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and most recently in Texas. I'm sure y'all have seen that on the news. And then Arkansas, which is again another state in our affiliate, passed a total ban on abortion that only has exceptions for the life of the mother or pregnant person, no exceptions for rape and incest. And I think the good news is that most of these, or all of these bills, any of those bans will be blocked by the courts. There will be litigation to make sure that those do not go into effect. Abortion is still legal and available in all 50 states of the country, but given what we're facing at SCOTUS and the concerns about the future of reproductive rights at the federal level, these are even more concerning than they would have been a year ago, given the change in the Supreme Court makeup and the Dobbs case that SCOTUS has decided to take. So what's going on in Kansas? In Kansas, we had a really big fight on our hands this year. The legislature passed HCR 5003, which is a constitutional amendment that would remove the right to abortion from the Kansas Constitution. So for a little bit of background, in 2019, the Kansas Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called Hodes and Nauser v. Schmidt. And they found that the Kansas Constitution guarantees the right to abortion under a broader right of personal autonomy. So basically looking at the intentions of our founders and looking at the document, it's very clear that decisions about personal autonomy and what to do with one's body are covered by the Bill of Rights in our state constitution. And that includes, among other things, the decisions about whether or not to end a pregnancy or carry a pregnancy to term. So obviously the anti-abortion lobby has been concerned about this and really is soon as that decision came down, began planning for a constitutional amendment campaign that would remove this right and overturn the state Supreme Court's decision. So if it's passed, this constitutional amendment would allow the legislature to pass even more restrictive laws. Kansas is a state where, yes, abortion remains legal and accessible. There are 4 healthcare providers in the state that provide abortion services. They're all located in Overland Park in Wichita. And we have more access than some states like Missouri that have 1 provider, or Mississippi that has 1 provider, but it's still not a very favorable climate as it stands right now. So this constitutional change would allow the legislature to pass even more restrictive laws than they have before. It would result in a total ban on abortion in Kansas if Roe is overturned, because there would be no federal protections, right? The protections in our state constitution exist separate and apart from the protections that are guaranteed by the US Constitution. So if we don't have the state constitutional protections and we don't have the federal constitutional protections, we're not in a good spot. The amendment also makes no exceptions for rape, incest, or a pregnant person's life and health. There is intentionally confusing language in the bill and very confusing ballot language that tries to invoke the idea that it could protect those exceptions, but it obviously does not. Most of the laws in the state right now that govern abortion do not have exceptions for rape and incest. So this is definitely a ploy from the proponents of this proposal to mislead voters. So it's really important to remember that that constitutional amendment does not guarantee exceptions for any reason. And because we were unable to stop this in the 2021 legislative session, it will appear on the August 2022 primary ballot. We had a really successful campaign around a almost identical constitutional amendment in 2020, and we're able to stop it. But after the 2020 elections, the legislature just got a lot more conservative, and it was really difficult. And honestly, it was impossible to find the votes that were needed to keep this from going to the ballot. So constitutional amendments have to be passed by a 2/3 majority in both our state house and our state senate. Then they go to a vote of the people for a simple, up or down simple majority vote. 50+1 is all that's needed from a vote of the public to pass this measure. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that after I'm done with this part of the presentation, but I'm going to talk about what's going on and what we're doing to make sure that we have a successful campaign and can stop this thing at the ballot box. But another interesting issue that emerged during this past legislative session was we saw anti-abortion lobbyists really pressing legislators and their supporters for a voter suppression bill, which I think is very interesting. I think we've all heard on the news, that awful wide sweeping voter suppression bill that was passed in Georgia. We've seen a big trend following the 2020 election from conservatives saying that the election was stolen, that there is widespread voter fraud, and what I think a lot of folks in the media have dubbed the big lie, right? That the election was stolen, it's not legitimate, and therefore there is a response that is coming from state legislatures, especially in more conservative states, to push state level voter suppression laws, using that narrative and that momentum to get them across the finish line. So in addition to passing their constitutional amendment, Kansans for Life and some of their allies in the legislature decided to move forward a voter suppression bill that would make it illegal for an individual to return more than 10 advance ballots at a time. And I probably don't need to lecture the League of Women Voters on what this bill does, because it would absolutely not surprise me if you all are very aware of that, given all of the work that you do to make sure that people have access to the ballot box and engaging voters in your area. So probably don't need to explain to you what that bill does, but I thought it was very interesting that, the same folks that were really pushing for this constitutional amendment and said, the voters of Kansas need to have their voices heard on this, actually don't want all the voters of Kansas to have their voices heard. So I think that's ironic and frankly, disappointing that an organization that really doesn't need to be meddling in laws regarding elections decided that the success of their constitutional amendment at the ballot box is critical and is contingent on fewer Kansans actually voting. So that's too bad.
Hey, Rachel, we have a question that might be pertinent here. Are any challenges expected to the Kansas anti-abortion amendment because it's being held in the primary? Will that have any?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I see it's from Steve. Hi, Steve. I'm not surprised that you're asking that. I would love to talk to you more about that. We are looking at legal options right now. So that is something that's being evaluated. I don't know if there is necessarily a path forward because of the ballot placement, because from what I understand, you know, technically they passed, there was an amendment to the bill that says that the election on this constitutional amendment is being held in a special election happening concurrently with the primary. So I think that was done, if I'm going to speculate, to possibly insulate the proponents of the bill from a lawsuit in that regard. But I will just say we're evaluating all of our options right now. So that is something we're looking at. And I probably can't say more than that at the moment, but we're looking at if there are options to litigate what is going on the ballot. So what are we going to do about all of this? We've got a constitutional amendment that, you know, outside of a lawsuit is heading to the ballot. We're working and acting and operating as if it is going to be on the ballot in August of 2022, which is still a decent amount of time away. So that is a little over a year out. Frankly, I'm sort of glad that as frustrated and disappointed as I am that we are putting people's fundamental constitutional rights up for a vote. I am glad that we have some lead time to do it, because what could have happened is, you know, it would still be possible for state legislatures to put constitutional amendments on the ballot in the 2022 session. So, you know, as I'm sitting here talking with, you know, folks at the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, at our national office, and, you know, talking to other people in the movement, there are, you know, in some ways we are lucky because we know what we're going to be dealing with in 2022, and we can build the campaign now to make sure that we're successful in defeating this thing at the ballot box. So what's it going to take? And I'm going to talk in broad strokes because, you know, I think that there's still a lot of decisions to be made about how exactly we do this. But I think there's really like 3 core principles that are going to be critical for us to be successful. So this is going to take a massive statewide voter contact operation. It is absolutely critical that Kansans understand what's at stake here. Despite the fact that, you know, I think Kansas has a reputation nationally as being a conservative, anti-abortion state, we know that Kansans are not, the majority of Kansans are not as extreme on this issue as the media narrative would have you believe. Most Kansans are pro-choice. A lot of Kansans have mixed or ambivalent feelings about abortion and really do not like to engage with it as a political issue. So despite the polarizing, you know, language from Kansans for Life and organizations like that, you know, Kansas is a state where most folks are pretty in the middle, and they are uncomfortable with banning abortion, especially in those cases where there are often exceptions in which this amendment does not provide for. So this is going to take talking to a lot of voters. It's going to take a large media operation. And one of the things we are focused on right now is raising money to make sure that that can happen. It's also really important that we center patients and the people that would be most impacted by this change. So I think one of the ways that we can talk to voters about this and talk to people in our state and in our communities and in our, you know, even in our families about this issue is really centering people who have abortions and why they need, why access is so important. You know, I think for a lot of people in Kansas and across the country, abortion has become a political talking point or a wedge issue that they don't like to engage in because they don't want to think about it. It makes them uncomfortable. It's not something they have intimate experience with. But the truth of the matter is that we all know and love someone that's had an abortion, right? 1 in 4 women will have an abortion before the age of 45. That's a lot of people. We all know somebody, and we all want ourselves or the women in our lives to have access to the care that they need. We don't want them to be shamed or attacked for their choices. And it's really important that we can share those patient stories so that people can understand that abortion is not an abstract political concept, but it is something that impacts the people you love. And that's why it's important. And there's also I think there's always sort of a debate in politics between, are we trying to persuade people who are in the middle, or are we trying to turn out our base? And to me, this is a false choice, especially in an election like this. So as I'm sure you all know, as folks who are really involved in this space, that, primary elections in Kansas generally have a lot lower turnout than a general election. They're also, Kansas also obviously has closed primaries. So the large number of independent voters that we have in the state typically don't participate because they typically can't. So one of the things we're going to have to do is not just persuade the people that are already going to show up, but we need to make sure that the people who don't always show up for primary elections are ready to go. So that means a lot of independent voters, and honestly, probably a lot of Democratic voters who may not be as keyed into the primary because we don't really have a hot button, Democratic primary election, right? Governor Kelly is running for her reelection, which is great. I don't know if we'll have a primary in like a US Senate race, but I think, registered Republican voters are very used to showing up in primaries. Democratic voters, perhaps not so much, and independent voters, not at all. So in some ways, this isn't just about persuading the people that are already going to be there on election day, but expanding the electorate so that more Kansans know that they have an option to participate in this process, and making sure that those folks show up. And then I'm sure folks want to know how to get involved. So when we're done and when I stop screen sharing, I'm going to drop this link in the chat. But we are starting, one of the first ways that we're getting people engaged is we're asking people to sign up to be a reproductive freedom defender. So this is going to be a list of supporters that want to take action for the campaign. And we are collecting names and information now so that you can be the first person to hear when there are opportunities to engage in this constitutional amendment effort. So one of the things you can do is sign up to be a reproductive freedom defender. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to engage. Oops, I just did the wrong thing. I shouldn't have clicked that button. I'll share it when we're done. There's going to be a lot of opportunities to engage, especially coming into the summer and fall, because the truth of the matter is we're still a year out and people have a relatively short attention span. So I think there's a lot of people I know there's a lot of people that have reached out to me and said, how can I get involved? What can I do? And I've often had to say to folks, wait a little bit, just because a lot of our efforts right now are the very uninteresting logistical things that go into running a campaign. It's like, okay, we need to talk about staffing. We need to make a budget. We need to do, file this paperwork. It's the very boring minutia of creating an infrastructure that will lead us to be successful, but it's really important. We need to make sure this is a very professional, just really strong operation from the beginning. But I know that there are people who are really eager to get involved, and I honestly love to see that. We're just still trying to figure out ways that we can do wide-scale voter education and get people involved in a way that will be most effective for where folks are right now. Because the truth of the matter is, just like the media is having a hard time focusing on reproductive rights issues, a lot of the most people in the state are not thinking about something they're going to have to vote on over a year from now, right? We all have our own stuff going on. They're worried about what is their kids' school going to look like in the fall. They're worried about making sure that their bills are paid. They are worried about keeping their family safe from the coronavirus. So I think we need to think about how are we right-sizing our efforts at the moment and meeting people where they are. But being a reproductive freedom defender is a great way to be on that short list of folks that will be called on to take action and that will get the most up-to-date information about the campaign as it moves forward. And it's also always good if you want to text this bit.ly, this link to a friend, that you know is supportive of reproductive rights and would care about this issue, and ask them to sign up as well. It's also always really important to share your story. I don't think everyone, if you have an abortion story, you're not required to share. It's your choice. It is obviously a very personal decision, but for some people who do have personal experience with abortion, they do like to use their story as part of their personal advocacy and outreach to their community, or use it to help defeat anti-choice legislation because it's important to them. So if that is something that you are interested in, or that you think someone you know would be interested in, we always want to connect with storytellers, because we think all stories are valuable, and there is no one singular abortion story. Everybody has unique circumstances, and for people who want to use their story to push back against anti-choice legislation and protect their rights, we can help folks with training on how to do that. We can help folks with media training. We can help folks with, plugging them into opportunities to share that story, to connect with other storytellers. And this is something that's always been a key part of our work, but that we're really ramping up in a big way ahead of this campaign. And as always, stay informed. Follow us on social media, check out our website. We are always trying to push out the best information to our supporters and to folks who are plugged in and passionate about reproductive rights issues. So that is something that we're going to continue to do, not just for this campaign, but that's something we're always doing. So if you want to get more involved or keep an eye out for the latest news and opportunities, those are two really great ways to do that. All right, and then the most important thing we have to do is in August of 2022, we all have to vote. So that is going to be the most critical way that we do this. We are going to have to not just do all the things that campaigns typically do, like mail and TV and digital ads, but like we're going to have to be talking to all of our friends, all of our relatives, all of our people in the state, and making sure that they know this is important and that they show up. And I know that all of the folks on this call are very good at mobilizing people and making sure that people have access to voting and access to the polls. So I thought you would appreciate this. Like, as always, the most important thing that we can do is vote. And that's really all I've got for today. So I'm more than happy to take questions. I'm gonna stop sharing so I can drop in the link to the sign up form.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Feel free to get any questions into the chat. I do have a quick question for you, Rachel, and I haven't had an opportunity to really formulate it in my head, so thanks for forgiving my clumsiness. But would you mind talking about, when we look at this HCR 5003, and it's, it has that intentionally confusing language. Yeah. Should it end in a total abortion ban? I mean, does that include things like a DNC where there is no fetal heartbeat present? Things along those lines. I'm just curious about, what are the types of things that these bans or limits really place on women and folks who are pregnant?
Absolutely. No, that's a really good question. I mean, my sincere hope would be that that is not something that I think that would be something that would be in some ways difficult to regulate out of existence. And generally there are some legal distinctions between the two, but as we know from like physicians who practice that kind of care, the distinctions between an abortion and miscarriage management can really blur in the case of someone's course of treatment, especially if they're having a difficult pregnancy. So I think those concerns are valid and totally fair. Another thing that we've seen in states that is really, this has already been happening, but I think would be particularly concerning in a post-Roe landscape would be criminalization of pregnancy outcomes. So there are already women in this country that have been investigated for, did they do something intentionally to cause a miscarriage? Or, did they, induce their own abortion? And because there is not a great legal framework for assessing these things, there can often be rogue, DAs or prosecutors, especially in smaller communities, that will bring those types of charges against pregnant women. We've already seen that happen. And I think that is a particular concern in a state in the future where where abortion is completely outlawed. Like if that were the case, we can definitely anticipate an uptick in those types of things happening. And it's usually already among the people who are most marginalized and in communities that are already over-policed, right? Like that's where we see that stuff happen. So I think that's concerning. And yeah, I think anytime we're getting politicians involved in like what medical care is legal and appropriate, like, yeah, how will it impact, a doctor who provides care to pregnant people, doesn't want to break the law and has to make a difficult decision about, a woman who is struggling with a challenging pregnancy, right? I think those things are real concerns that we have to think about, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's not just the end. It continues to be a very slippery slope.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really, just on that note, like I think it's really easy when you're a politician to make laws about things that you know very little, right? Which may be like pregnancy related medical care, and have unforeseen consequences to those things. So yeah, it's totally possible that legislators think they're doing one thing and in practice could be doing another.
Rachel, you talked about kind of the campaign gearing up.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, what kind of structures are you implementing? How are you gaining lists of people to, I mean, I don't have a good vision about what your plans are going forward. And I agree with you that, setting the structures now is very important, but you also have to have an idea of how people are going to be contacted and persuaded.
Absolutely.
So that's my question.
No, it's a great question. So right now we have a coalition that's really 5 key organizations that are at the table. And that includes us, Trust Women, who's the independent abortion provider in Wichita, and the ACLU, and a couple other folks that are at the table. So we're all working together to start basically a separate organization that's going to have its own brand and rollout in the summer. And we're working with all of our lists to try and get some of that base, those baseline list building things done. We've also hired on some staff that have done this work in other states, including folks that defeated the Personhood initiative in Mississippi in 2010. So that have done some red state reproductive rights work and have like some national expertise. So I'm really excited about the folks that we just brought on actually like last week to help build the campaign. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. In terms of like, what are we going to be doing? I think everything's on the table right now. I think that the next year is really going to be about voter education and making sure that people who are probably not paying attention to this issue or who have heard something about it really understand what the stakes are. But the closer we get to election day, there's going to be way more opportunities for like phone banking, canvassing, all of those types of things. Because I think in some of our targeted areas where we know like this is where we win the election, like we'll need sort of all hands on deck for a more volunteer driven like voter contact work. But some of this stuff we're also still figuring out, right? And one of the biggest things for us right now is like polling, right? We need to see where people are. We polled this issue back in 2019 and, had numbers that were promising, but, like people have had more time to learn about the issue. It's been more, it's been talked about in 2 state legislative sessions since then. And there's all these changes that are going on at the federal level that people might start paying attention to. So one of the things we have to do is like poll again and sort of see where we are. And that will help guide, especially early stage decisions about where are we putting resources? What do we need to do? Who do we need to move on this? And we just need better data before we can make a lot of those decisions. But that's a good question. And I wish I knew more. And I feel like if I was having this presentation with you guys in August of like this year, I would have so many more interesting things to say. But right now I'm just like, we have to get the paperwork done and we have to pull and we have to staff up. So.
And we might need to have you back.
I would love that. Anytime. Okay. I'm always down. This is great.
We have a question in the chat. Does the American Medical Association have a position? What are medical providers doing to take a stand on the inappropriateness of legislators deciding medical care?
That's a great question. I haven't seen anything huge from the AMA lately. They've issued statements before on anti-abortion legislation. They also had issued a statement, I think it was last session year, about the medication abortion reversal bills that we were seeing, and weighed in on that issue. One of the biggest advocacy organizations, well, they're not really just an advocacy organization, but one of the biggest medical organizations that really does a lot of work in this regard is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They are always super on top of, you know, as the professional organization for OBs, like they are very involved in this. They have an advocacy section. They do policy papers and position papers on laws like this. And they also have a lot of really good like in-state networks of physicians that care about these issues. And we'll often, you know, you'll often see them come to like to speak at the Capitol sometimes, you know, individual doctors that are really concerned about these types of laws and how they impact patients. But AMA is definitely, you know, somebody that we would need to be like talking to and thinking about. Sometimes they're a little hesitant to engage, but they have before on issues like this. Are there other questions that folks had?
You can feel free to unmute yourself with your three little buttons up in the top if you want to ask a question, or you can put it in the chat.
And if not, that's okay too. I'm sorry I didn't run longer. I feel like I'm sorry. I hope I didn't waste any of your time by being 15 minutes short here, but.
Not at all. It was really, really good information, really concise, and gives us a lay of the land. And that really does make sense that you're gonna lay the groundwork, and we need to go ahead and sign on as reproductive defenders so that we're ready when you've got the plan to go.
Yep, that's the best thing we can do right now. And, you know, I think what's really important to remember is that this fight has always been a long game. And I think it sometimes feels like the sky is falling and everything's bad. But like, you guys know, like we've been having this fight for decades. And no matter what happens with SCOTUS or what happens here, like we all just have to remain committed to like making sure that women can get the care that they need, whatever that looks like in the future. And you know, we'll just do everything we can. You know, we've had fights like this before. We've had moments where, you know, with Casey, right, where it's like Roe could go away, and you know what, people are still getting abortions. People will always get abortions, and what we need to do is just make sure it's as, you know, it's legal and it's safe, and that we're there for those people in our lives that will need care no matter what comes next.
What I find interesting, but I don't know if it's an effective way to couch it, if I look at all these restrictions, it is simply a way to control women. I don't know if that's, and of course the other side couches it in the term of, no, we're protecting the unborn. So those, I guess, are our two polar extremes of the views. Do you feel that's accurate, or?
No, I think that's absolutely part of it. I think that, you know, this is really about government overreach. Like what authority does the state have in our personal lives, you know? And I think for people who think that, you know, protecting the unborn, as they say, is like a value that they hold, I don't think most of those people are not necessarily like far right anti-choice extremists, right? I think you can hold that value and still also see that like women's lives matter too. And that the consequences of stuff like this is not actually a pro-life vision, right? But yeah, I think it's absolutely about controlling women. It's about what role does the government have in the most intimate parts of our lives. And I think Kansas in particular is a state that has like a slightly libertarian bent to it, you know, especially out in like West, right? You know, people don't want the government in their business. Why should this be any different, right? But no, I think you're spot on.
I think what makes me most angry and somewhat impressed, the person who came up with the term pro-life, because in actuality, there's nothing pro-life about the anti-abortion movement. It doesn't protect women's health. There's nothing about protecting children once they're born. There's nothing about the death penalty. Really, it has nothing to do with life in general. It's pro-fetus. And yet whoever came up with that term was brilliant, and they just ran with it.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's good branding. But yeah, sometimes they don't really have the juice to back it up, do they?
That sounds really good.
But it sounds good. Good soundbite, good brand, but bad policies. You're not wrong. Cool. Well, I really appreciate everybody's time today. It was really nice to talk to you all. And
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
We did have one comment saying the number of independent voters seems to be a real disenfranchisement of people for a vote on a constitutional amendment. And that's an issue for us as the league.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and that's all for y'all to decide how you engage in that. I think that there's certainly an argument to be made whether or not what the legislature did was legal by putting this on a primary ballot. The intent obviously still is to disenfranchise independent voters, right? And I think that's made even more clear when we saw KFL, Kansans for Life, pushing for these restrictions on advanced voting this year. I mean, they were sending emails to their supporters, they were lobbying legislators, like they pushed really hard for these voter suppression bills. And I think that there's a real clear pattern of evidence that like this is about making sure that not all Kansans vote, right? They want their voters to show up. They don't want all voters to show up.
I have a question about how that works. If it's done during the primary, will every voter have to declare a party even if they're not voting for anything other than this particular issue?
No, independent voters will not have to affiliate to participate. They could, if I'm an unaffiliated voter and I request an advance ballot or go to my polling place on election day, I would get a ballot that just has this question on it. So I think the bigger issue is like, do voters know that, right? Like
Right. Exactly. I mean, I didn't know it.
Yeah. Like,
I don't pay attention. So
yeah, I think the intent is still to make sure that like those people don't show up. But if they do, yes, they can vote on this.
So that's something we really need to let people know and make it really clear.
Absolutely. But yes, they will not have to affiliate to participate in this election. And it is important that people know that. And that's going to be part of, we're going to be making sure as well that people understand that. You can vote and don't let anybody tell you they can't. Because they're wrong.
Well, thank you so much again, Rachel, for your time. I appreciate it. And I want to encourage everyone to note that Kristen Salmons, our immediate past president, is presenting on her experience at the UN Commission on the Status of Women 65 on Monday night at 7 p.m. So it's kind of a bonus hot topic that we have. And all you have to do is click on the link that I will be sending all the membership. We don't have to go through pre-registration. So thanks again. Really appreciate your time, Rachel.
Absolutely.
And, yeah, and this recording will be on our YouTube channel. So I'll try to reach out to, I know some people had trouble getting on, and I will try to reach out to them to make sure they can access the recording for the great information.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
You bet. Bye all.
Have a good one.
Thank you